The Boston Celtics had a little bit of a roller coaster win last night in Game 3. They come out on top 106-99. It was clear that the Mavericks, with their backs against the wall in the series deficit coming into this game, came out with a level of fire. And they were throwing the punches early in this one, built themselves up a 13-point lead. But even after that, it just didn't seem like they were necessarily going to be able to match up with the Celtics team, where we saw early on Kyrie Irving was getting himself going. He had a massive bounce back performance. As Jaylen Brown put it, it was vintage Kyrie, but it wasn't enough. And despite the Mavericks taking that 13-point lead early, the Celtics were able to quickly battle back and make it just a 1-point game by the end of the first quarter. Jayson Tatum had easily his best quarter of the finals so far this year. You can say even the half as a whole, 13 points in the first quarter, another 7 in the second quarter to make it 20 in the half. And he and Kyrie both, I mean, for some degree, obviously, Tatum's on the winning end, but I did think that this was overall a pretty good Kyrie Irving performance, even though obviously with how everything played out at the end with Luka Doncic fouling out, all eyes were on Kyrie, and he wasn't necessarily able to overcome the odds. I have a hard time single-handedly blaming him for that. Kyrie scored 15 points in the second half, finished the game with 35. He was 13 of 28 from the field. He finally found his three-point shot, 4 of 6 from the three-point line after being 0 for 8 in the previous 2 games combined. But like I mentioned, as much as it felt like things were going in favor of the Mavericks during the first half, you look up and it is just a 1-point game. Jayson Tatum has his 20 points, but outside of that, the next highest scorer for the Celtics was Sam Hauser, who came off the bench and hit 3 threes. But Jaylen Brown really struggled offensively in that first half, just 6 points on 2 of 6 from the field. And then in came the Celtics tsunami, I believe it was, that Mike Breen described it as in the third quarter, where the Celtics just absolutely took over there. Jaylen Brown really woke himself up, and he was phenomenal down the stretch of that quarter. Celtics were 11 of 18 from the field, 5 of 11 from 3. They scored 35 points to Dallas's 19. Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown together outscoring the entire Mavericks roster. So the Celtics closed the quarter phenomenally as well, which has been a little bit of a topic of conversation with this Celtics team, is they have struggled to close quarters in the past, and this time it was Jaylen Brown putting the exclamation point when he crossed up Kyrie, I believe it was, at the top of the three-point line and got himself through the lane for a vicious dunk that again just made it feel like everything was all Celtics. The Celtics lead ended up blossoming up to 21 points early in the fourth quarter, and then we saw again, as much as this is a great win for the Celtics and they are on the brink of a championship, we saw a lot of the old Celtics, the ones that has had people hesitant to go ahead and pick them in this series and for the past number of years, where late in these games it just seems like their offense gets a little bit stagnant, where and especially in a scenario like this where they were playing with a 21-point lead, it seemed like the only thing that was going against them at that moment was the clock. So they were trying to wind it down. They were starting their action in those possessions far too late, and it was just resulting in bad mid-range shots and a lot of forced shots at the buzzer. And ultimately, the Mavericks started to go on this run that got to 22-2. And just like that, it was a 3-point game in the fourth quarter, which brings in the conversation of the referees that has a lot of people up in arms this morning, where Luka Doncic, in I believe it was 3 possessions, fouled twice on the defensive end. It was a Jaylen Brown post up in the short corner on one. Listen, a lot of people are arguing that it could have been a Jaylen Brown offensive foul. It could have been. They could have possibly challenged that one where Jaylen did sort of have his arm around. Now, Luka was also tugging at the Jaylen Brown jersey. Again, it's up to you really to decipher how you think that it should have been called, but it was called a foul on Luka. And then from that point, Luka has to be more heads up that the Celtics are going to attack him in that moment. The Celtics, really all series long, have been going after Luka Doncic on the defensive end. We're going to get into some numbers later in the show here, talking about the struggles that Luka's had on defense, not just in this series, but in the playoffs as a whole. Yes, I know he's also been dealing with injuries, so I'm not saying it 100% has to be an indictment on who he is and who he's going to continue to be in his NBA career, but the defense for Luka has been abysmal, and even on that 22-2 run, it was the Celtics attacking Luka to get their couple points there. But point being, Luka ends up trying to step in, and I think he was maybe trying to draw a charge from Jaylen Brown. It definitely wasn't an offensive foul. You can make an argument again that maybe the refs just have to swallow their whistle in that moment, but ultimately Luka has to understand that as the best player on the other team with 5 fouls, the Celtics were going to attack him. And for as much as Luka throughout the entire series was just sort of allowing players to blow by him, that this is the instance you want to step in and intervene, there was no way he was getting that charge call in this instance. He wasn't even close to being set. Obviously, your feet where they are isn't the only factor in that situation, but again, I just thought it was far too risky of a move for Luka to try and step in there in transition against one of the best transition players in the NBA and Jaylen Brown, and then get absolutely fired up afterwards, yelling over at his bench to challenge the play afterwards, where you put yourself in that position. But again, we're going to be getting into Luka shortly, but ultimately, with 4:14 left in the game, Luka fouls out, and at that point, it just feels like it is wraps for the Celtics, where the Mavericks have been this fun dark horse team, especially through the entirety of the second half of the season. They've been an awesome watch, but it's still an offense that is very reliant on isolation basketball. And taking Luka out of the equation, it was entirely on Kyrie at that point. And listen, again, I know he didn't necessarily step up to the heroics of 2016 Kyrie when he hits the shot. They actually referenced that exact shot when he tried to pull up over Al Horford with about 25 seconds left in that game. But an extremely difficult shot to hit, and ultimately, once Tim Hardaway Jr. comes onto the court, who, listen, I know that I'm not going to throw any shade or anything, but when Michael Wilbon is talking about, Tim Hardaway Jr. is the key to the series, he said that, I believe, prior to Game 2. Udonis Haslem on ESPN as well is talking about Tim Hardaway Jr., who's been in all these big moments. It's been clear that the Mavericks have not trusted him whatsoever, and and again, not to get on this whole Tim Hardaway Jr. rant here, but, at that point, it was taking away your offensive creator. Definitely struggled on defense as well, but Tim Hardaway Jr. was no better on the defensive end and didn't provide any of the offense, where I don't think that he's scored a point yet in this series in general. So it was definitely a very tough sequence there for the Mavericks. The Celtics end up closing it out, their 10th straight win in the playoffs, and now are on the potential brink of being the first team in NBA history to sweep both the conference finals and the finals, doing so because of the big shot from Jaylen Brown where he scored in isolation. I believe it was over Tim Hardaway Jr., and that ultimately wrapped it up. Celtics win this game, and that definitely will have some impact. I feel like the shot that Jaylen Brown hit on the finals MVP odds, which we're going to be diving into later in the show as well. But ultimately, it was just a situation where it's clear that the Celtics team is just so much deeper than the Mavericks, despite what some of the narratives were coming into the series. And I thought that this was the best bench game of the playoffs from Boston's 3 players that they rolled out on the bench, including Xavier Tillman, who was not getting minutes for the Celtics for the majority of this postseason. I believe he only briefly played in the Cleveland series, and outside of that, it's been a non-factor. I can look back at it as well. He might have gotten a little bit of run time as well in the Pacers series as well. Did have a couple games where he got some actual minutes, but ultimately, Sam Hauser, Peyton Pritchard, you have the 3-pointers that went down, specifically Hauser. Xavier Tillman hit the corner 3 as well, but in most part, it was the defense and the way that Luka and Kyrie were trying to seek out these guys on the offensive end or the defensive end from the perspective of these 3 players, and they did a tremendous job holding up against Dallas's stars. And again, you look at last series for the Mavericks where they played the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are one of the greatest defenses that we've seen in recent history, and the way that the Celtics just have this elite level of switchability has been tremendous. But we are going to continue on that conversation of the way that specifically you look at Hauser and Pritchard and how they guarded Luka Doncic, who overall struggled in this game, both from a shooting perspective, the defensive perspective that we already talked about, and some of the maturity levels. He made some very interesting comments after the game, after he fouled out, talking about the level of physicality that they were allowed to play with and such. And there was definitely a level of irony to those comments that I want to dive into. But before we do all of that, we're going to be taking our first break of the show. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.